Morning, everybody. How we doing today? It's good to see y'all. Thank you so much for being here, for hanging out with us. Whether you are here on campus or if you're with us online, just thank you for being here. Before we get into what we're going to talk about today, I just want to say something real quick. Matt's going to come up at the end and talk about this, but I just want to give a special invite. We're doing a thing this afternoon right after our second service. It's going to start right around 12 o'clock called What's Next? And it's literally kind of this gathering that's just designed, if you're sitting here trying to figure out like, hey, what's next for me in my faith journey? What's next for me when it comes to maybe my involvement in the church? How do I get more connected? How do I get more plugged in? That's what What's Next is all about. It's only an hour long, and it's from 12 to 1. We have a lot of fun. It's really chill. It's really laid back. You just get to meet other people. I'll be there. I'll share a little bit. And so if you are, again, if you're wondering whether you've been here for whether this is your first time here or you've been here for 50 years, if you're trying to kind of figure things out and figure out, hey, what is next for me? I really want to invite you to that. And hopefully I will see you there because I'll be there. So like I said, Matt will come up with more details at the end, but I just wanted you to hear from me that if that's at all you, please go. Love to see you, love to meet you, love to connect with you. This week, we're finishing up this series called Future Church. And we've spent the first month of this year talking about what does it look like for the church to thrive in the world, the constantly changing world that you and I live in. And so we've been talking about this, one on kind of like a macro level and looking at the culture that we live in, kind of the society that we live in, broader, what we call like the Western world, which is what we're a part of. And we've been looking kind of at cultural trends and everything within the Western world, but we've also been then specifically focusing in on us here at FCC. And what is it going to take? What is it going to take for us to be able to thrive in the world, the ever-changing world in which we live? And so far as we've gone through this, we've looked at three ideas, essentially three images. And these are things that we think that, man, if we could stay focused on these images, if we could allow these images to kind of shape how we think about the church, how we function as a church, then this could really lead to renewal and thriving. And here's the three images we've looked at so far. We've looked at the cross, the vine, and incarnation. And if you were here the last 3 weeks or you watched online, you know what these mean. I'm not going to break them all down. I encourage you to go back and watch. But the cross is essentially the way our lives should look. The cross is for Jesus, it's about sacrifice, it's about submission, it's about service. Jesus told his followers, hey, if you want to follow me, you have to pick up your cross. So the cross is the shape that our lives individually and collectively should take. We should be about service and sacrifice and submission. The vine, this is the image that Jesus used to talk about remaining connected to him. That faith isn't just a checklist of things, I believe this, I believe this, I believe this. Faith is about this interaction with the living God through Jesus. And that's this picture of the vine. And last one, incarnation. This is a fancy word, the big theological word that's used to talk about God becoming a person, God becoming flesh and blood in the person of Jesus, that Jesus is sent into the world. And what Jesus says is that the same way that he's sent into the world, the church is sent into the world. And so the church is this missional entity that we have been sent into the world by God. And so these are the three images that we have looked at so far. And today we're going to close out this series by looking at one final image that we get from the New Testament. That I think if we can grasp these images, if we can let these images kind of shape and form the way we think about the church and the way we act as the church, it can lead to really, I think, renewal and thriving in the future. And so before we get into the last image, I want to start with something Jesus said in John 10 that is I think is incredibly powerful, it's incredibly meaningful. It's a verse that if you've been here at all, I've quoted it many, many times. But John 10 is a famous passage. Jesus is teaching and he's talking about himself as the good shepherd, and he's saying what makes him the good shepherd, and he's comparing himself to people who have come before him who have claimed some kind of special access to God. And what Jesus says, he says, listen, all these people that came before me that claim something special, he describes them as thieves and robbers. So they're all thieves and robbers. And then he goes on to make this one last comparison about these thieves and these robbers and himself. And here's what he says in John 10:10. He says, the thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. I have come that they may have life and have it to the full. And so Jesus, as he's comparing himself, he's saying, listen, all these other people, they weren't here for your benefit. What they were doing wasn't about you, it was about them, it was about their own glory. They came only to kill and destroy. But then Jesus says, the reason that I'm here, the reason that I have come, the reason that I'm ultimately going to die and resurrect is so that you can have life, and not just life, but you can have it to the full. That word full, like if you translate it, New Testament's written in Greek, that word means like abundant. exceedingly, more, overflowing. Jesus said, this is why I came. I came so that as people, you could experience this full, abundant, excessive, overflowing life. Now, let me just say right off the bat, Jesus' definition of a full life is very different from our cultural definition of a full life. But still, this is Jesus' point. He says, this is why I came. I came so that you could have what N.T. Wright and what John Mark Comer referred to as human flourishing. That's why Jesus came. I came so that you as human beings, so that we as human beings could flourish. Now again, even though Jesus' definition of human flourishing doesn't necessarily match up with the cultural definition of human flourishing, whatever definition you use for human flourishing, our world has seen very little of it over the last 2 years. I mean, if you look over the last 2 years and you look at what has gone on in our world since March 2020 came along and the pandemic started and everything that's happened since then, again, not just the pandemic, all the other stuff that's happened since then. I mean, you have the pandemic, you have COVID, you have disease, you have 5 million people that have died worldwide just of COVID, not to mention all the other things people die from. The economy, its effects on education, mental health, isolation, anger, violence, hate, division. Whatever definition you use of human flourishing, our world over the last 2 years has seen, really, I would argue, almost none of it. I mean, we live in this world that's defined by all of these things, defined by violence and hatred and division and disease and death. There's been a lot of words and a lot of phrases that people have used to describe the last 2 years, what this season of life has been like. But the one that I kind of resonate with the most is the word disruption. That really what the last 2 years have been, ever since, at least in where we live, since March 2020, since all the pandemic stuff kind of kicked in, it has been a disruption. Now, there's like a practical level where it's been a disruption on. And what I mean by the practical level is, as soon as 2020 kicked in and all these lockdowns and everything came, a lot of our plans were disrupted. Education was disrupted. Going to work was disrupted. A lot of us didn't go to work for a long time. Some of us still don't even go into work for a long time. The economy was disrupted. Travel was disrupted. I know people whose wedding plans were disrupted. Vacations were disrupted. Kind of where we were going in our life, that all kind of got disrupted. And it continues to be disrupted. So there's kind of like that surface level of disruption that we all feel in the practical day-to-day. But I would actually argue that the last 2 years have been a disruption at like a deeper level. Like it goes deeper than just, hey, I can't go on vacation, or I can't go to this concert, or I can't go to this. Like there's something far more fundamental to the way our society operates that this whole thing has disrupted that. And to understand why it's been such a huge disruption on like this core foundational level, you have to go back in history and you have to look at the movements that have shaped the culture in which we live. You have to go back and look at the movements that have shaped, again, what's known as the Western world. So there's a movement that emerges in the 14th century that's known as the Renaissance. You may or may not be familiar with the Renaissance. There's a lot that goes into the Renaissance, but the Renaissance is essentially the movement that brings Western Europe out of the Dark Ages and into what's known as modernity. And really the center of the Renaissance, what Renaissance really kind of is all about, is Renaissance centers around this idea that's known as humanism. And so what comes out of the Renaissance is human beings become front and center. Before that, a lot of things would revolve around God or religion or other things, but no, Renaissance puts human beings, we become the center of the universe, we become the center of life, and it's all about us people. So humanism thrives in the Renaissance, and again, that movement begins to lead out of the Dark Ages. Now, piggybacking on the Renaissance comes the scientific revolution, which is in the 16th century. And the scientific revolution then is what puts like science front and center, and where we get like the scientific method. Then out of the scientific revolution in the 17th and 18th century, you get the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment is this philosophical movement that really is all about human reason and individual freedom. Human rationality, human reason, this is the highest good, this is how we truly know things, this is what really matters, and what's most important is the freedom of every single individual. It takes the focus off the larger community and puts it upon us as people. And so, again, that's a very condensed version. But what you have is you have these three movements, the Renaissance, the scientific revolution, and the Enlightenment, that they kind of piggyback one another, and they build this narrative that ultimately drives the Western world. And so what comes out of these three movements is this belief that ultimately we are heading toward this utopian future, and that what's going to get us there is science and technology and individual freedom and human reason and individualism. See, throughout these three movements, over the course of these centuries, what happens is what's known as the secularization of the West, where historically, even going back to the Roman Empire, when the Roman Empire converted to Christianity, we lived under this thing called Christendom, which was where Christianity is the majority culture. But again, beginning now with the Renaissance and moving through all this, Christendom begins to die, and even now the world we live in is not a majority Christian culture. We don't live in Christendom anymore. And so we live in this secular culture, and the narrative that operates at like the foundational level is that our individual rights, our individual freedoms, science, technology, human reason, this is all going to lead us to this utopian future. This is the progressive Western dream. This is what has driven our society, again, for centuries. It starts back in the Renaissance in the 14th century and just builds and builds and builds. And so this is the narrative that's been operating at like the most foundational level of our culture. Now, there's been other times where we have run into disruptions in that dream, where things have happened and it's like, ooh, this is a bump in the road of us getting to this perfect utopia. A perfect example of that is World War II. World War II comes along, and again, it is this global thing, and it's this horrific thing, and there's mass death and everything. And so that's kind of this like, well, are we really moving toward this utopian future? And so, yeah, it's this bump. But then if you look at it, what's interesting is you come out of World War II and you come into, like, at least in the United States, you come into the 1950s in the United States, and that's where we're like living the American dream. And so even though World War II comes along as this like disruption to this progressive Western dream, we managed to bounce back from that into the 1950s. And now we're living the American dream, and everybody gets a little house with a picket fence, and it's all good. Of course, what's fascinating about that is what do the 50s lead to? That leads to all the chaos of the 60s and 70s and all the division of the 60s and 70s. But even with that, I would argue we bounce back in the 80s. And the economy takes off, and it's like, no, we're still living this dream. And so even along the way, as we've hit these moments of disruption, somehow we've always managed to bounce back and to land on that dream that begins in the Renaissance and the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment. That no, science and technology and medicine and human individual freedom and rationality and reason, this is all leading us to this utopia that we're going to get to. I think the reason that this disruption has been so like difficult on like a foundational level is because this is the disruption that has put the final nail in the coffin that progressive dream is dead. I think it's been dying for a long time. It's been slowly dying. But now we're at the point where I don't think most people in our culture, I don't think most of us, if we're honest with ourselves, we don't look at the future and go, oh yeah, we're moving up into the right. This is all going in the right direction. I mean, you just look at it from an economic standpoint. The younger generation, like the emerging generation now, they're going to be far worse off than their parents economically. That's the first time it's happened in a long time. In our culture, it just doesn't happen. Like one generation, it gets better. It's supposed to get better. But now we're looking at it going, yeah, but it's not. For those of us that are, maybe the baby boomer generation or older, things are going to get worse economically for your children and grandchildren, great-grandchildren. I mean, just look at how we view the future. Okay, when I was a kid, this show was a little bit before my time, but I do remember watching this show sometimes. When I was a kid, our view of the future was the Jetsons. Everybody remember the Jetsons? Yeah, the Jetsons was like this utopian view of the future where it was all technology and everything, and they had Rosie, I believe was their maid's name, and she took care of everything. My favorite part of the Jetsons, and if you're younger, you probably never watched the show, and that's okay, but my favorite part of the Jetsons is when they would get ready in the morning, they would stand on this conveyor belt. And the conveyor belt would move them, and like the conveyor belt would brush their teeth, and then it would like put on their makeup and do their hair and get them dressed, and then they would just go. It took like 10 seconds to go through this conveyor belt. But that was the belief. It was like, hey, there's all this great technology, and it's going to make life better, and everything's going to be awesome. You know what our view is of the future now? We're killing each other for food. It's the Hunger Games. That's our view of the future. You look at the movies we make about we're literally killing each other for food. Or you got the Matrix, where these great machines that we created have enslaved us, and now we're fighting them for our freedom. And so even you look culturally, look at how we used to view the future, and you look at how we view the future now. See, the reason that this whole thing has been such a disruption is at like a foundational level. It has literally been, I think, the final nail in the coffin of this dream that started centuries and centuries ago with the Renaissance and the Revolution, scientific revolution and the Enlightenment, that, hey, things were always going up and to the right, and human reason and science and technology and medicine, they were going to make everything better and better, and we were progressing toward this utopian future. But now it's like, no, we're not. That dream just isn't a reality. It never has been. And now I think for the first time it's finally seeping in that the future isn't necessarily going to be better. We're not moving up and up and up. Now I know you're sitting there thinking, why did I come to church today? This is like the most depressing day ever to come to church. Like, why don't we talk about hope or grace or anything? Now, hold on with me, because it's going to get a little bit worse, but I promise you it will get better. So even now we find ourselves tears into this thing, and we begin to talk about, okay, what happens when COVID becomes endemic? What happens when it becomes, like a seasonal flu or anything? What happens when we get over this? But I want you to notice even the language that we use. What's the language that we use when we talk about getting through this whole pandemic thing? For the most part, we don't even use the phrase getting back to normal. We use the phrase new normal. What's our new normal? Because we have understood that when you go through things like this, inevitably things change. We were talking to our kids a while back. We had gone to the airport and we were flying out and we were going through all the security things. And we started telling our kids, we're like, man, I remember years ago, like, you didn't go through any of this security stuff. Like, you used to be able to walk people out to the plane. You used to be able to watch them get off. And we're telling them, like, what it was like when we were kids, or even what it was like when like, Linda and I started dating and all this kind of. And then they looked at us and they said, well, what changed? And the answer is simple. 9/11. Right? I mean, that happens, and what the result is, hey, there's all these changes, that things change. So when you go through these events, they produce change. And so all of us are aware that, like, okay, there's no going back to the way that things were. Things are inevitably going to be different. We have to get back to what is our new normal. We're not ever going to go back to the old normal. You can't go back. Things don't go back. You can't rewind it. We're going forward. That's the only way that time works. And so what is our new normal? And that's the question we ask, that's the question we struggle with. What does our new normal look like? Here's the even worse news. Okay, what is our new normal? So if you go back in time before the emergence of our like Western progressive dream that reason and science and technology were just going to take us to this utopian future. So you go back before that dream emerges out of the Enlightenment and Renaissance and all those movements. What was the normal for people before then? Before there was this belief that we were inevitably going to this better future, what was the normal for people in the world? And here's the super depressing part. You know what the normal was? Disruption. That was the normal. That when you look back in time and you look back at the story of humanity, you see people who they were just constantly living through wars and through famines and through plagues, and you would go through that and then rinse and repeat, and you would go through it again and again and again. That was like, the thing about our Western progressive dream is what we believed that we could conquer human nature and Mother Nature. And what we've learned is we can't. We can't. We are at the mercy of human nature and Mother Nature, which means what? We're going to live lives of disruption. The Psalms is this collection of songs in the Old Testament. Right, it was like ancient Israel's like, this is what their poems, their songs, their worship songs. When you read the book of Psalms, if you read through it, what becomes really clear really quickly is that the ancient Israelites lived in constant disruption. There's a great psalm, Psalm 46. I'm just going to read the first couple verses, because when you read the first couple verses of Psalm 46, you get the disruptive nature of the world that people lived in. This is what the psalmist says, Psalm 46. God is our refuge and strength, an ever-present help in trouble. Therefore we will not fear, though the earth give way and the mountains fall into the heart of the sea, though its waters roar and foam and the mountains quake with their surging. And so the writer of the psalm says, well, here we go again. Mountains are going to fall into the ocean. This whole thing's falling apart. It's all just going in the crapper. Here we go. But notice there's not this like, oh my goodness, how could this happen? I didn't expect this. There's kind of this sense of, this is what happens in life. that you keep going and you keep doing your best and you keep striving, but things happen. And the mountains fall into the sea and things don't go the way that you planned and things don't always work out. And there's this hope that God is our refuge and strength during these times. But this is just the way that life is. It's this constant set of disruptions. So the bad news is the new normal that we're entering into is disruption. Because the truth is, that's always been the normal. I mean, we may have convinced ourselves for a few centuries, at least in the Western world, that we were pulling out of that and that we could control Mother Nature and we could control human nature and that science and technology were going to make everything perfect. And again, please don't hear me. I'm not criticizing science. They've done a lot of good things and continue to do good things. What I'm saying is that's not the answer. That promise has not been delivered that, hey, we're going to this utopian society because of all these things that we have been able to accomplish. Truth is, we have always lived in this state of disruption. But now we get to the good news. Okay, so even though the new normal that we're going to enter into is disruption, because the reality is that's always been the normal, God, the God of Israel, the God who comes down to the earth in the person of Jesus, God is a God of order. God is a God who likes structure. In fact, if you read the book of Genesis, the creation story is this story of God bringing order out of chaos. And so the biblical story is God out of chaos, he creates this ordered world. But then as a result of rebellion and sin, God's ordered world becomes completely chaotic. But the biblical story then is God returning order to a chaotic world. He's bringing it back to what he originally created it to be. That's God's mission throughout the entire Bible, Old Testament, New Testament. God is bringing order and structure back to his chaotic world. He accomplishes that through the death and resurrection of Jesus. When you look at the death and resurrection of Jesus, that's the central part of it. That this is the means by which God is restoring creation to what he originally created it to be. Now, after Jesus dies and raises again, and he ascends up into heaven, what Jesus does is the mission that was his, he then passes it on to the church. And he says, church, you are now given the mission, the task of going into the world and continuing what I started. To continuing to bring structure and order and meaning into a chaotic world. The church is the means by which God continues to carry out his mission. And again, I'm not going to dive too far into that because this is what we talked about last week. We talked about the missional nature of the church. But here's what I want to say this week. Most people in our culture, most of us, even those of us who would say, yeah, we're Christian, yeah, we're part of a church. A lot of us here I know probably aren't. We're just checking things out, and that's totally awesome. I'm glad you're here. But for those of us that would say, yes, I'm a Christian, I'm part of a church, one of the mistakes that most people in our culture make, and I think I'm guilty of making this sometimes too, is we underestimate the power and the significance of the church in our life. We do. And the reason for that is because, again, in our culture, we have made the church something that we consume. We've made the church a good. We invented the phrase church shopping. I'm gonna go find a church that does exactly what I want. I'm going to go find a church that meets my needs, which essentially means I'm going to go find a church that I agree with everything that the pastor says and everything that they do, because if I disagree, then I get mad. And so, we create I've said this before, but when you read through the book of Acts, which is the book in the New Testament that talks about the origin and expansion of the early church, you never hear people church shopping. You never hear people talking about I don't go to the church in Ephesus. Their worship sucks. Their worship team is they're terrible. I don't even think that person can sing. I don't like the church in Corinth. Their preacher, he's kind of lame and he's dumb and he doesn't speak. No, they didn't do that. Because see, the thing is, the church was never a good. It's never something you consume. It's not a place. William Tyndale, who is probably most famous for translating the Bible into English, translated it into the English language. William Tyndale ultimately gets killed, and he gets killed, let me make sure I get the year right. He gets killed in 1536. And a part of the reason that he gets killed, not the whole reason, but part of the reason he gets killed is when he was translating the Bible into English, he took this word ecclesia, which is the word that's translated church. So if you were to open a New Testament and you saw the word church, more than likely it's the word ecclesia. He translated the word ecclesia as congregation, which is like the people. The Holy Roman Empire, of which he was a part of, did not like that translation. That's part of the reason they killed him. Literally, they didn't like the way he translated. I mean, there was other things that called him a heretic, but that was part of it. The Holy Roman Empire, preferred the German word Kirche, which means cathedral. So because Tyndale talked about the church as being the people and not the building, not the structure, that kind of idea, again, in Western civilization got silenced, and church became a building. It became a place. It became a location. The church is never a location. It's never a place. It was never a building. When Jesus talked about the church, he never talked about it as a building, as a place, as a structure. He never talked about it as an institution. See, part of what happened over, again, the whole secularization of Western culture and even mixing power and all this stuff is the church became an institution. It became a place. It became a location. And it was never supposed to be. It was always supposed to be a people. Ecclesia literally means assembling. It means gathering. It is the people. And see, when Jesus talked about his church, he wanted his church to be defined by one thing. And it wasn't a structure, it wasn't a building, it wasn't a place, it wasn't a fancy mission statement or a cool logo or great marketing or an awesome website. He wanted his church to be defined by one thing. And he demonstrated it to his apostles in what's known as the Last Supper, this like intimate meal that Jesus shares with his followers right before he's arrested and he's killed. He's together with them around this table. They're celebrating the Passover, which is a big Jewish holiday. And they're all there around this table. And you know when you get together around holidays, when you get together around tables, there's like intimacy and there's connection. And when he's with the 12 around this table in this like special moment, here's what he does. John records this in his account of the life of Jesus, the book of John. John's an eyewitness to this whole thing. And John writes it down. And John says, here's what Jesus did when we were together around this table. He got up from the meal, took off his outer clothing, and wrapped a towel around his waist. After that, he poured water into a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet, drying them with the towel that was wrapped around him. So at the table, he gets up and goes around one by one and washes his friends' feet. That was like the lowest form of service that you could do. And it's what he does. He serves them there around this table. And then he turns around a couple verses later and he tells them this in verse 14. He says, now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet. Jesus said, what I have just done for you is what I want you to do for other people. And then if you skip a few verses down in the chapter, he makes it really clear. He says, a new command I give you, love one another. As I have loved you, so you must love one another. And then here it is. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples if you love one another. See, Jesus makes it really clear. He said, listen, my church, the people, not the building, not the institution, not the structure, the people are to be defined by one thing, their love for one another. He said, you have watched the way that I loved you. And what I have done for you is what I want you to do for one another. Now here to me is the coolest part of this whole like Last Supper kind of cool table event. This becomes like a guiding image for the early church. The early church doesn't just take this idea of loving one another. They do take the idea of loving one another, but they also take the intimacy of this moment and of meeting around the table. When Luke writes in the book of Acts, which again is the story of the early church, in Acts 2, as he's describing the church, listen to how he describes the early church. He says, every day they continued to meet together in the temple courts. They broke bread in their homes and ate together with glad and sincere hearts, praising God and enjoying the favor of all the people. And the Lord added to their number daily those who were being saved. So Luke says, listen, you know what the early church continued to do? What Jesus did with the 12. They would meet together and they would meet around this table. They would have this intimacy around the table. Because when you're around a table, especially in the first century world, being around a table was about acceptance. It was about community. It was about sharing more than just food. You were sharing your life. You were encouraging. You were supporting. You were loving one another. There are over 100 passages in the New Testament. We call them one another passages. Because they literally say within the church how we're supposed to treat one another. And it all flows out of what Jesus did. They say things like, love one another, encourage one another, serve one another. And this is what happened around these tables in the early church. That these people they didn't get together in buildings. The church didn't have a building, the church didn't have a structure, not that there's anything wrong with that, but it was the people that got together and loved and served and cared for one another. I would love to sit here today and look at y'all and be like, you know what? I'm killing it in my life. I've never been doing better. I'm excelling at every level. There's awesome and then there's me. Life has just never been better. Like, I would love to be able to say that. But I would be lying. If I'm going to be totally honest, completely vulnerable, I'm not doing very well. I've gotten my butt kicked over the last 2 years. It has been brutally hard. I don't, hear me out on this because it's important. I don't say this because I want you to feel sorry for me. Because I also know I'm not the only one in here that feels this way. In fact, I would venture to guess most of us do. The thing about being a pastor at a church is whenever someone leaves the church, you always take it personal. Always. And I know maybe you shouldn't, and people tell you that all the time, but let me just say this. If you ever go to a church and the pastor doesn't take it personal when someone leaves, you should leave that church. Because that pastor is a jerk who's just going to create a trail of bloodshed and doesn't care about anyone. You always take it personal. You always take it personal. Because there's something in you that man, God has entrusted me to love and serve and care for these people, and I didn't do a good enough job, and was there something more that I could have done? And so it hurts. It hurts, and sometimes you make decisions, and you know that when you make a decision, well, some people aren't going to be happy with this, and a few people leave, but man, you look at the number of people that have left, and this is not true of FCC, this is true across the country. Churches have just been gutted. Mental health statistics of pastors, not good. And it hurts. It hurts badly. And throughout this whole thing, I've heard pastors stand up, some pastors stand up, and they talk with absolute clarity of this is what you need to do, and this is what you should do, and if you don't do this, you're disobeying God. If you don't, and every time I hear them talk so clearly, there's part of me that wishes I could stand up with that much conviction and just say, this is what you have to do, and if you don't, you're disobeying God. But to be honest, people that do that, I think they're arrogant, short-sighted, and full of crap. I just do, because here's the thing. The early church, you look at the early church, James, the brother of Jesus, when they're trying to decide whether or not to let Gentiles in the church, they have this big meeting. And you know what James says at the end of the meeting? This is the brother of Jesus. These are his words. Well, it seemed good to us in the spirit. I don't know. We thought about it. We prayed about it. This seems like the right thing to do, but I don't know. So even the early church, even the apostles, even James, his friggin' brother. A lot of times you go through life and you do the best that you can and you seek God and you seek wise counsel and it's you know what? I think this seems good to us in the spirit. And you do the best you can. And man, in this world you get beat up for that. And it has been brutal, and it shakes me to my core and to my confidence, and it's just hard. It's hard, and even then, I'm a father and I watch. Some of y'all heard me talk about my son. He gets bullied every day. And that's not related to this, but it's one other thing. And again, I don't say any of this. I don't say any of this for you to feel bad for me, because most of us in here feel the same way. You may not have the exact same issues or experience that I have, but for all of us, this has been hard. And for so many of us, we are hurting, and we are broken, and we are lost, and we are confused, and we struggle with doubt. We're not flourishing. And a big part of the reason we're not flourishing is because the church in our culture, in our context, is not what it's supposed to be. See, the church is the environment that God created for human beings to flourish. When you go back into, and when you look at the early church, they lived in constant disruption. They lived in the Roman Empire, an empire that was incredibly hostile to Christianity. And you know what? They thrived. And do you know why they thrived? Because they were the church. Not because they had buildings, not because they had structures, but because they would meet together in tables and they would love and serve one another. They were there for one another. They thrived because the church was the church that Jesus dreamed that it would be. See, the church, this is, when I said that we underestimate the power of the church, this is my point. The church is the environment that Jesus created for people to experience human flourishing. And in a world that is defined by disruption, we will not flourish apart from a healthy, thriving church. And what I'm telling you right now is that I will not make it through this thing without you. And I sure as hell won't make it through as a pastor without you. But I also believe that you won't make it through without us. See, as a church, if we want to be a healthy, thriving church, a church that creates an ecosystem for people to flourish and thrive, even in the midst of disruption, then what we need to do is we need to recover the idea of the table. I mean, again, here's these images. I want to put them up here one more time. These are the images we've talked about. The cross, the vine, the incarnation, the table. That's the one I want us to get today. This is the image that defined the early church. They were this community that met together around this table where they loved and served and encouraged one another. And it wasn't about formality. It wasn't about structures. It was about people who genuinely loved and cared for one another. See, the church in our culture is a walking contradiction. Paul, you know how Paul refers to the ministry of the church? Paul says the church has the ministry of reconciliation. That's our job, the ministry of reconciliation. How on earth can we be about the ministry of reconciliation if within the church and our culture, we can't even live reconciled with one another? We can't. I mean, all that stuff about like anger and division, I wish that was all external to the church. But it's not. It's within. That's why we're not thriving. That's why we're struggling. If we want to create an environment here at FCC, which I desperately do with all of my heart, if we want to create an ecosystem where people can flourish in the midst of a world that has been and will continue to be defined by disruption, then we need to recover that image of the table, that's who we are. There's nothing wrong. Hear me out on this. There's nothing wrong with church buildings. There's nothing wrong with church structure. Like I said, God is a God of order. And whenever you have people, you need structure to get things done. And there's nothing wrong with that. Stuff's all fine as long as we remember that's not the core identity of who the church is. We are the people. And what we have to be committed to is one another. And so if we want to recover that idea of the table, here's like two things I think we need to do. One, as people, we need to commit to the church. We are at a point in time where in our culture, less and less people commit to the church. Even people who go to church, even people who say, hey, I'm a church tender, they go less than twice a month. And I'm not criticizing you. I'm not trying to make you feel bad. Again, part of it is we just don't appreciate the significance of the church. And please, when I say commit to the church, I'm not saying commit to the institution or the building. I'm saying commit to the people. I'm not sitting up here taking attendance oh, you're here today. Oh, so-and-so's not here today. Oh, we got that's not what it's about. It's not about committing to an institution. It's about committing to a people and saying, I'm agreeing, I'm choosing to commit my life, to bond my life to you. You are my people. You are my tribe. You are the ones that I journey through life with. When I need help, when I need prayer, when I need encouragement, you're the ones that I reach out to. The institution doesn't need a commitment. The people do. We need to make that commitment to one another because the thing is, our commitments shape us. And so let's be committed to one another. And the second thing is, this one seems kind of obvious, but do what you can. And here's what I mean by that. A lot of times, because we define the church as like a building, we define the church as an institution, we wait for professionals to do things. Like when someone comes up, we're like, I don't need to say hi to someone. There's professional greeters out there that say hi to someone. So I'll let the professional greeters, they have the nice shirt and everything. Or I've had people tell me all the time, they'll be like, hey, something happened to so-and-so and the church didn't do anything. And as I'll talk and find out, I'll be like, well, no, I mean, their group prayed for them and they brought them meals and they didn't. Oh, you mean I didn't do anything? So it's like, well, yeah, but I'm not the church. We are the church. And so ministry isn't something that like staff does or leaders do. The leaders, the staff of this church, we create environments that help foster spiritual growth. That's what we do. But ministry is what we all do for one another. Don't wait for a professional greeter to say hi to someone. You say hi to someone. If someone's sitting by themselves, invite them. Say, hey, why don't you come sit with me? Introduce yourself to someone new. Hey, good to meet you. I don't know you. We go to church together. Sweet. Like, do what you, if you know someone who's hurting, if you know someone who's struggling, write them a card, pray for them, send them an email, encourage them, send them a text. 2 weeks ago, I was out in front of the big cross over here. And Bud Zink, some of y'all may know Bud Zink. Bud Zink's been around here for a long time. Bud and I have been around here for about as long a time. And I've known Bud for a while, but we've never had like huge, deep, we're a couple guys. It's not like we sit around and talk about deep things. But we're standing out in front of the cross, and Bud just came up to me and he said, how you doing? And we talked for about 10 minutes. And it was one of the most life-giving conversations I've had in a long time. Because he was just asking me, hey, how are you? And he was telling me a little bit about himself. And it wasn't earth-shattering, but it was beautiful. It was powerful. It was the church. See, that's what we need to do. The only way the church thrives, the only way we as a church at FCC thrive in the world in which we find ourselves is if we recover that image of the table. That we're not a building, we're not a structure. We are a group of people gathered together who are committed to loving and serving and encouraging one another. The table is actually the one thing that Jesus told his followers to carry on. And they did it through something that we call communion. As you came in today, hopefully you got a little cup of the communion. If you don't have one, if you want to raise your hand, we have people in the back that'll bring you one. But communion is just two simple little things. It's a piece of bread and it's a little cup of juice. And the bread reminds us of the body of Jesus that was broken for us, and the cup reminds us of his blood that was spilled for us. And Jesus told his followers on that night, the night that he washed their feet, he said, I want you to do this to remember me. And so we take communion as a church, one, to remember what it is that God has done for us in Jesus. But we also take communion as a church to remember who we are as a community. That we are a family, committed to one another, and gathered around this table so that we can share life together. And so if you want to go ahead and peel back the top if you haven't. Got to peel back the little clear piece to get the bread. And you can take the bread. That is his body. And if you want to peel back the other part, and if you want to take the cup that reminds us of his blood that unites us all together. Let's pray. Father, I thank you for your love for us. I thank you for what it is that you did for us. I thank you that you gave your everything. And God, we live in a world filled with disruption. And as we look to the future, it's going to continue to be disrupted. But God, that doesn't mean there's no hope. That doesn't mean life will always be chaotic. That doesn't mean life will always be empty. Father, you promised us that we could have a full life. And the church is the ecosystem. It's the environment that you created so that we could experience human flourishing. And Father, I know I haven't always been the church person that I should be. I haven't always loved and served the way that I should be. And God, I know that in our culture, in our world, even within our church, we haven't always been the church the way that we should be. But Father, my hope and prayer is that this time we will come together and we can show each other and our community what it's really like to be the church. Father, we love you. We thank you. We pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen.